in terms of adapter and all that? Okay. Good. Well, next up is Philipp Bojahr from the Cologne Game Lab. He's a postdoctoral researcher and lecturer at the CGL, working in the field of game studies and game design with a focus on new media applications in museums and other cultural contexts. As part of a tandem position that he has at CGL, he's also working in this field on a practical level at the Siegerländer Museum, I guess we would say it in German, in Siegen, where he serves as a curator with a focus on multimedia and multimodal presentation. He studied media studies and media culture at the University of Siegen and received his doctorate in media and theater studies from the University of Cologne for his work on aesthetic and technical visual forms of montage, assembly, /assembly in video games, which I think is connected to the topic of your presentation, if I'm not confused, right? So yeah, let's give a welcome to Philipp, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And yes, Federico told you, I'm going to take you back to this my doctoral thesis because the idea, like I read the topic of the conference, liminal space, as something that reminded me of the principle of montage, because you only have a space between when you put some things together. And yeah, I'd like to start by like a similar starting point, like a Serafin, by saying video games or computer games, I use the terms interchangeable, are their own art form. Nowadays, this statement is accepted in most discourses, and even art historians and museums agree. You said the MoMA, for instance, started collecting video games in 2012, and exhibitions about video games aren't a novelty anymore, which doesn't mean they are not necessary anymore. Obviously, we see that here. That's I think an exhibition from the Victorian Orbit Museum a couple of years ago. Now, if computer games are their own art form, it can be interesting to look for similarities to other art forms and the presence of principles in the computer game which are prevalent in those other art forms. And one of these principles is the principle of montage. Now, and if we talk about montage, we have to get on the same page about the term's meaning. And what a better way to start that off with a quote from the Oxford Dictionary, or to look it up there. And as you might have guessed, it's a French loan word coming from the verb monter, which we also have in English to mount in a sense. And montage is defined inter alia as the technique of producing a new composite whole from fragments of pictures, texts, or music. And for example, it's the artistic principle behind film editing, and historically closely tied to its biggest promoter, Sergei Eisenstein. Probably heard him, or Panzerkreuzer. What's it? I don't know what's in the English. Panzerkreuzer Potemkin, like the film about the battleship. Battleship Potemkin, yeah, sure. Okay, but next to this, these principles also employed in other forms of art. Painting, the collages of Braque and Picasso, sculpting, for example, the assemblages of Tinguely, cut-ups in literature, Hans Arp, later Burroughs, and also theater, maybe the multimodal installations or stagings of Piscator. Brechtian theater was most often staged in a montage way. And it even goes as far as music. There we have modern classics, composers like Bernd Alois Zimmermann, for example, who heavily relied on the combination of elements that are already there to form new stuff. So that's about what I understand as a principle of montage in a very broad way. And having seen that the montage is present in many art forms, we can now ask what forms of montage can be found in video games? And moreover, do video games have their own forms of montage? Thinking back to Marshall McLuhan's famous statement, the medium is the message, meaning the content of any medium is always another medium, we can start by looking for forms of montage adapted from other media by incorporation of those media into the video game. One can find such forms most easily when the computer game emulates other media or aspects thereof to a certain extent. For example, filmic cuts in cutscenes. To illustrate that, an exhibition shot montage works in Psycho as well in any other game. Like we start with a shot of an exterior, the exhibition shot, like some, it's not working, but you see on the top left, showing us the place, and then we cut to a narrow perspective, and we get that it's supposed to be connected, that we're gonna see the place in detail that is shown in the exhibition shot. And it works the same way in live action cutscenes from Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, an old game by now, but still famous for the live action stuff. I see some guys chuckling. See Ray Wise, an old Twin Peaks star on the right. And it also works, of course, with rendered cutscenes. For example, Red Dead Redemption, we start with the show of a boat, steamboat, and then we get the close-up of the protagonist. So, for reasons of keeping short, I won't show you, I won't go into detail about the other art forms, but you have to trust me that you can also find the principles of collage from the visual arts and also music and stuff incorporated in the video games, at least at some points. Okay, so far so good. But does the video game offer more than like an assimilation of other montage forms from other media? After all, the video game is at least a very complex remediation of older media in the sense of Bolt and Grusen. And the fragments we just identified are but small pieces of the gameplay. And by gameplay, I mean the process of playing a video game. I'm not the first to ask that question. In his book, The Language of New Media, Lev Manovich takes a detailed look at the occurrence of the principle of montage in digital media and arrives at a somewhat paradoxical conclusion. On the one hand, he notes that CGI and the ability to produce seamless images and sequences via digital compositing is replacing classical analog forms of montage. He calls that the new media's resistance to montage. On the other hand, he also sees the advent of new complex forms of montage with digital media and its new means of production, but then illustrates these by using experimental movies from the 1960s to 80s as prototypical examples. I know that might sound confusing, at least to me, but it doesn't detract from the validity of the mentioned new forms, which can be also found in the video game. One example of these forms is the so-called ontological montage, which Manovich defines as the coexistence of ontologically incompatible elements within the same time and space. As an example, he refers to Rybczynski's short film Tango from 1980, which also won the Academy Award of this year, which shows a room overlaid with a growing number of loops. Within these loops, people interact with the room and with each other, but not with people from different loops. Thus, they seem to be on different ontological layers that are combined within the same space via montage. As an example from the realm of video games, I brought the puzzle game Gorogora, which is played through a number of tiles that make up an ontological montage as well. And the central game mechanic plays exactly with the changing of the ontological status of those tiles and its contents, as you can see here. As said, next to the ontological montage, there are also other types like the stylistic or the spatial montage, and Manovich is able to find examples of them in the area of film, and you can also discover them in video games. So I can ask again, is that it, or are there more forms of montage that are not only predominant in new media in general, but exclusive to the video game? Taking another look at Manovich's The Language of New Media, we find a fallacy that points us into the right direction. As an example for the video game's resistance to montage, he states that games like the shooter Quake are a seamless, continuous experience, and indeed, that might be the primal desire of many game designers. But then, we all have seen something like this before. A loading screen, this example from Baldur's Gate 3. And though it might seem inconspicuous at first, it is something very special. Looking at the aesthetic layer, it ties two segments of the game together that can be described as scenes. Thus it can be seen as a film, a filmic cut. so close to film editing. But there are differences. First, it's not instantaneous. It leaves a temporal gap and thereby evokes a space. And second, it is marked by the absence of intention in the first place. The loading screen is not born out of aesthetic intention, but technical necessity. Why is that? Now, a game is no linear medium like a typical movie. What you see and hear while playing a game depends on the interactions, and thus a game and its aesthetical output can't be predetermined. It has to be assembled during gameplay. And from a platform studies or STS perspective, that process is not unlike that of industrial assembly. To drive that point home, what we see here is a diagram from a German textbook on industrial assembly for engineers. I put the rough English translations below. And if we compare that production process to digital games, we see some similarities. In the end, we have the customer, the gamer in our case, and in the beginning, we have the base material, that one that's the vertical on the side. And this material in our case might not be a steel beam like in industrial assembly, but a photo of a steel beam or an idea of a steel beam that is made into an asset in the first step. And those assets are used in the game development to form a game product, which is kind of a pre-assembled but still modular thing, which is only actualized on a technical platform that could be called distribution system during gameplay. Thus, we have a twofold assembly process, one step more towards the parts manufacturing side during game development, and one step more to the distribution side during gameplay. Ideally, the prevalence of the principle of industrial assembly is hidden from the gamer, but in moments like loading screens, we get a glimpse or at least a hint to the technical underbelly on the aesthetic layer. And since loading screens themselves are a form of aesthetic montage, we have a case of a technical form of montage affecting an aesthetic one, and that is very peculiar to the video game. At this point, I have to note that the idea of exploring the alignment between aesthetic montage and technical assembly is no arbitrary quirk of mine, since the principle of montage was originally derived from the idea of industrial assembly. At the start of the 20th century, artists from various forms of art possessed their impressions of the industrial world by engaging with the underlying principle of assembly. Especially the Dadaists also redefined their role as engineers and their work as assembled products. Here the famous kitchen knife collage from Hannah Höch, who, like with other Dadaists, especially said we are going to be engineers in the new industrial world, and our products are montages, are assembled products. And yeah, that's more easy to grasp in French and also in German, because there the term montage is used for both meanings. We use it for industrial process as well as the artistic technique. Coming back to the computer game with one last question. Does this alignment between technical and aesthetic montage only happen in loading screens? No. While the technical process may be the driving force behind the creation and of the spatial and temporal void, there are different aesthetic strategies to fill or conceal it. First, like the first other example, the integration of minigames to keep gamers busy while the loading of the main game commences. What we see here is a sketch of a so-called auxiliary game, and according to the functional diagram from the original patent, it's called an auxiliary game in the original patent filed by the developer Namco in 1995 for the PlayStation. The goal is, and I quote the patent here, is to prevent unnecessary wastage of time. Second, there are also more advanced forms of aesthetic and diegetic concealment of the loading process, with varying success. If you ever played Metroid Prime or Mass Effect, you may have wondered why the elevators in the future are moving that slowly. It's because the game is loading in the background. Another more elaborate example can be found in XCOM Enemy Unknown. There the loading takes place while the player observes their squad's transportation to the battlefield while taking part in the mission briefing. It's a new take on making mission briefings for the player diegetically plausible, because mission briefings as part of loading screens have, or like giving game tips, have been around for quite some time. Third, finally, the drive to minimize visible interruption also leads to technical approaches like procedural loading, which try to eliminate loading screens altogether, save for the one when you start the game session. That's kind of unavoidable. But even then, we sometimes get a glimpse in the form of glitches or even bugs, which demonstrate that some dynamic technical process lies below the aesthetic surface. For example, if you fly in Minecraft's creative mode into one direction for quite some time, chances are that the computer won't keep up with loading the map chunks on time, and you literally see the game world being assembled before your eyes. So I'm like, with every good montage, there's the hard edge at the end that concludes my tour de force into that field. Just like a cut into the topic. There are many things you could discuss. For example, is materiality important for making a montage? Isn't it important? Stuff like that. But I guess I stop at this point and see if I have evoked some questions or comments or critique.
Right. Thanks, Philipp. Yeah. So once again, what questions and comments do you have? Please raise your hand. Also reminding people online, if there's anyone online, type your questions in the chat. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. That was so interesting. I wonder, because if you made the connection to Eisenstein, I wondered if you'd thought about the actual materiality of the linear analog film. I love the engineering description, absolutely, of Montage. But in an analog film, what you'd be looking at that's analogous in some ways is the film leader strip. You know, so at the beginning, it's say if you've got a 16mm reel, you've got a black strip. And that's kind of like the loading screen of a film in some ways. I just wondered if you thought about those analog parts of media.
That's true. I devoted quite some time or like space in my PhD to speaking about like the liminal stuff, in a way, like where can I find some elements that are in the video game also in other media, and there are quite some elements that can be seen at some points in time. And of course, you can also say that you have loading screens or test screens in other media, but my argument would be that they don't that they don't have the provoke the same kind of insight as with other media. But I love your question, and I totally it's a valid point to say, okay, the beginning of the film strip is also kind of loading screen denoting the materiality of the medium, and thus makes it possible to see through it. And of course, things like a tear in a film, that's would be even more in the way that it's also kind of a cut, also not intentional, accidental, but that it also highlights the materiality of the medium. And that is, of course, not an argument of mine, but this is like Reinberger or Friedrich Kittler, or Bruno Latour, for example, who thought about stuff like that accidents show us the mediality of the medium. Sure.
Thanks.
Hello, you mentioned what was it? The XCOM 2, and it's not a loading scene, but the ship commands scene in which you can see all the different sections of the scene. Acts like the rear window, Hitchcock rear window scene. Could it be seen as a form of montage?
Most certainly. At one point, I also argued, or like when I elaborated on this ontological status or statuses, that many screens we see in a video game are a composition of different ontological layers in some way. So basically, for example, if we look at a management game, like on earlier example, Yoot Tower, Sim Tower, I don't know if you know that, like where you view or where you build a tower from the side, sort of, like you have a cut, and it's similar to the scene you're describing. That's pretty clear. Like you have the game world, you see it from the side, but you also have a menu, an interface layer, and so on. and there it's very clear that stuff is on different ontological layers. But with XCOM Enemy Unknown, it's more complicated in a way, because they are from a functional perspective, you're right, but then the game is all about making things diegetically plausible. At the end, you don't have really a reason why the commander you're playing, the commander of this military ship, why you see it from the side and why there's a slice. Yeah, it tries to get you to, suspension of disbelief, to get that up in this regard. So a very complicated, convoluted answer to your question, I would say yes, definitely. It's different ontological things together, but then with XCOM, it tries to minimize you recognizing that.
All right, I think if you have a short one, I think I can fit it in, but yeah, let's give it a shot.
I didn't formulate the question very well in my mind, but still ask. It reminded me the work of Harun Farokhi and the parallel 1 to 4, and he's talking about this, the representational side of images is changing, and the images now become more operational, part of a function. So did you consider Harun Farokhi's work in your thesis, or any reflections on that, if you're familiar?
Yeah, at least to some extent. In a way, from a formalist perspective, because he's working with split screens a lot, split screen installations, not really a split screen, but a multi-monitor setup and stuff. And I'm trying to avoid your question by telling you an anecdote, because I once I curated an exhibition where we've shown a work of him, and I think there was a 4-page text document on how we had to synchronize, precisely synchronize the work. So in a way, I recognize this work. I know, validate like this experience. But like from my point of view, it is of course what he says is true. But then I'm not so much about video game art, but like I'm coming from a practical perspective, looking from a platform science technology approach combined with an aesthetic analysis of like commercial video games. So I definitely would agree with him, but was kind of outside of my scope.
All right, thanks very much. That is now definitely all the time we had. So again, let's
thank you for your
Philipp.
questions. Thank you.